Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us for the fourth in a series of live, free conversations about race and social justice with various experts in their fields, followed by open feedback and dialogue conversation, and they're designed for ongoing pathways for wholehearted communication. My name is Elsa Dimitriadis. I am the CIO and co-founder of Conversation Starters, and tonight will be an opportunity to explore the relationship between faith and faith leaders and social justice. And we were having such a great time talking backstage. I know you all are really going to enjoy this. Between faith and faith leaders. So some places of worship shy away from having such a discussion of social, political, and human rights issues in their congregation, while others dive into advocacy. Historically, faith and religion have played a significant role in major social justice movements, including the 1950s and 60s fight for civil rights. Religion have played in the 1950s, civil rights leadership and activism, including shifted from northern elite for civil organizations focusing on legislative change, such as the NAACP, to southern communities focusing on direct action, such as the Montgomery bus boycott, in which African American churches provided the meeting space, the training ground, and religious inspiration. And many Southern civil rights leaders, churches, came from a strong faith background, and they drew on religious values that asserted the equality and value of all people. Southern civil rights in 1957, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., in an effort to sustain the momentum of the Montgomery movement, he brought together more than 100 African American ministers to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and King served as the first president. He brought together, and then the student arm of the movement, which took on a leadership role in the 1960s with the sit-ins and the founding of SNCC, the first, was also informed by religious values and was led by seminary students, such as the late John Lewis, who identified their Christian conscience as the motivation to activism, and who found students great strength in their faith when they faced fear, conscious danger, and violence. And they worked together, toward creating what King called the beloved community. Fear, conscious. So, though the language and the ideals of the civil rights movement drew creating primarily from Christianity, there was a lot in it that appealed to other people of different faiths and backgrounds. Movement, the idea that God was on the side of oppressed people that resonated with Jews. For some and background, the religious language of the civil rights movement connected directly to their experience of Judaism with Jews. And for others who did not identify as religious, the civil rights movement became a religion of its own. Their experience of Judaism, both the Reform movement and the conservative movement invited King to speak at their national meetings. The Reform movement had publicly supported civil rights since the beginning of the 20th century, first coming out against lynching in 1899 and passing resolutions throughout the 1950s and 60s and beyond, asserting their commitment to civil rights and racial justice. Resolutions, the prominent rabbis of both movements were public civil rights activists, speaking out to their congregations, marching with King, and getting arrested at demonstrations, sometimes to the disapproval of their own congregants. Among the most famous was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in the conservative movement whose photo you might know. He's marching arm in arm with King in Selma in 1965. And it's become an iconic image of Jewish civil rights activism. You might know. And he described that march as Josh praying with my legs, image of and that's often quoted by Jewish activists. He described Catholics played a prominent role in Selma. Josh praying much more than in previous civil rights demonstrations by Jewish activists. Before Selma, never before had Catholic activists turn out in such large numbers. In response to Bloody Sunday, King had wired religious leaders across the United States, urging them to join the Alabama protest. And in Chicago, Matthew Amon he was the executive director of the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice. He sprang into action and he called Chicago, calling priests who were sympathetic to civil rights. And he said, "Put on your clericals," he told them. "If you don't wear them anymore, look under your bed." Conference staff worked the phones, mobilizing their network of 112 local Catholic interracial councils. And so there were priests, nuns, and lay people who made the pilgrimage to Alabama in unprecedented numbers, adding a distinctly Catholic presence to the Selma protests, who made the pilgrimage to, and I say all this to set the stage for now. We're decades later, the Black Lives Matter movement is at its strongest, and I say all religious communities continue to participate, even as the movement leadership lives, may take on a more secular or grassroots form. And I say all continue to participate. While religious leaders and institutions have played, may take on significant and varied roles in the protests, they're standing in solidarity with protesters, and there have been messages of healing and justice and role. You see people kneeling and praying in solidarity. It's important to ask, and there have been, how does faith contribute to the movement for racial justice and kneeling and related issues? What role can pastoral care or religious ethics play in shaping social justice, kneeling and issues? How can religious communities apply their historical legacy as key drivers of the civil rights movement to the current moment? Communities apply. So I wanted tonight to invite some people that could uniquely speak to these questions. To the current moment. I'd like to begin by introducing our first guest, Lenice Emanuel. She's the executive director of the Alabama Institute for Social Justice, which is located in Montgomery, Alabama. The Alabama Institute for Social Justice is dedicated to the empowerment of women, justice, people of color, and addressing poverty in marginalized communities through the platform areas of child care advocacy, women, voter engagement, and gender equity, poverty, grassroots organizing, environmental justice, and racial healing and reconciliation. Engagement and gender. During Ms. Emanuel's career, she has secured and managed more than $30 million in grants that have served to positively impact a range of social justice issues, to include academic, economic, racial, and gender equity. She's a climate reality leader and part of a core of advocates and influencers in 152 countries, trained by former Vice President Al Gore. She holds certification in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University, a Master of Liberal Arts degree in leadership and ethics from Spring Hill College, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology from Auburn University, Master at Montgomery degree. And welcome, Lenice. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. I was wondering if you could start by talking to us a little bit about the work that you do at the Institute. What is a typical work week look for you? I'm wondering if you could start.
Before COVID, I actually could have
what is a typical work week look
on a daily basis. Now it feels really chaotic, quite honestly, because the base of people that we serve have been hit the hardest in this sort of COVID world that we're living in. Much of our work takes place in Alabama's Black Belt counties, which are some of the poorest counties throughout the state of Alabama. These are people who have lived with generational poverty and are in essence really trapped in cycles of poverty. And so these are communities that before COVID hit were underinsured or did not have insurance at all. They were dealing with environmental justice issues that are tied to them having raw sewage in their homes and in their yards, not having clean water. The things that you need in order to really sustain yourself, in a pandemic that we're now living in. This idea of actually being able to shelter properly is something that is very unstable for those communities. So many of them sort of live from sort of family home to family home, and it is impossible really to operate in the context of social distancing. So we have whole families that have gotten sick. We have whole families that have actually died, like one after the other. So it's been quite chaotic, and we've actually sort of morphed into being much of a relief organization because some of the basic needs are just there. In terms of childcare, we have childcare centers that don't even have the resources to purchase much of the PPE that they will be required if they are to actually reopen, and to actually have to close for we in Alabama were down to about 12% of childcare centers across the entire state operating at one point, and then at only half capacity. Of course, they are providing childcare services to many of the essential workers that we all have grossly, historically, many of us have not appreciated. And so it has been tough. And so because that is our base and our population, we have been directly impacted because you cannot lead people. If you are unable to be there for them time of need, you can't be positioned to talk to folks about policy and reform when they're hungry. And so that has been what much of our work has been in today's climate.
So in a normal non-COVID world, your work tends to be more advocacy than direct services, and now you sort of shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, by design, we were an advocacy organization in terms of how the organization came into existence in 1972. In fact, it was started by a group of African-American women in Selma, Alabama, who wanted equitable child care. And so from its sort of inception, it's been a child care advocacy agency. And what I really wanted to do when I entered as the ED about 4 years ago, with this sort of 40-plus year legacy of an organization that really was sort of born out of the civil rights movement, I really was trying to figure out how we can continue that legacy in a context that was really broader than just childcare, because so much of the work had really become this sort of integrated body of work where, once again, you can't sort of deal with childcare in a vacuum if people are having employment issues. You can't deal with childcare in a vacuum, if people are having transportation issues. And so we, by design, intended to create a broader context of the work, but really it's really been mostly about advocacy. But the other part of this work has really been around racial healing and reconciliation, which is the work that I was probably most drawn to when I first started this work. But in all reality, the work is taking a bit of a being. And with the Black Lives Matter movement, we really are now collaborating with organizations that are really abolitionists. There's really no other way to define them. They are really freedom fighters in a modern context. And so this idea of Black Lives Mattering is really not new for our organization. We've always understood that. But we have found that there's a need to sort of create this tension around the work, which is we must be advocating for folks and looking at policy and how we can better ensure that policies are being implemented that will actually improve the communities that we serve. We've got to continue, though, to call out equity and push for equity, and we've got to continue to speak truth to power. But I personally have always believed that there also has to be a place where we can bring people together and create spaces where we can have meaningful conversations and educate folks, and sort of create a space where people can learn how to be allies in this work, specifically white people. I think that, coming up in a home where we've always had very diverse relationships, although I'm from Pritchard, Alabama, which is probably 88% African American and really still considered a very high risk, high crime community. I grew up in a home where both of my parents were educators, both had master's degrees. So we were sort of living in a community that really wasn't quite emblematic of what was actually happening in our home. home. And when my father became a minister and ultimately a pastor, that certainly had a direct impact on really how I saw myself in the world and how I would engage, particularly around racial justice work, because what I'm hoping we will talk about as well tonight is this real direct connection between faith and justice. I think that we've gotten it really wrong over the years. But for me, growing up in a home where both of my parents attended Alabama State University during the Civil Rights Movement, they marched with King. They were very engaged in making sure that I was really indoctrinated to understand my place in the world and that context. So for me, it was a very natural sort of connection, this idea of infusing racial justice work with faith. Although, obviously, as a nonprofit leader, we are careful not to sort of posit ourselves as a faith-based organization, because we're not. We're careful not to proselytize, because that's really not our mission and vision. But on a personal level, it certainly does guide, and it certainly does sort of undergird my approach to this work. And I think that in those contexts, particularly of racial justice, Christianity, its foundation being a religion of love, is a perfect place for me to exercise my faith in this sort of desire to bring healing and reconciliation.
Thank you. Can you drill down a little bit on what you were talking about, that we haven't always gotten it right, that relationship between, faith and faith leaders and a role in racial and social justice work?
Yeah. Well, to put it bluntly, I think that if you look at this country's origins, if you look at the role that slavery played in terms of establishing what we have accepted as a social norm, which is racism, and was intended to influence the world, but in essence, the world has influenced the church, and the white church in particularly will have to reckon with the fact that they have played a direct role in ensuring this sort of complicitness around racism in this country. If you are a reader of the Word of God, we know that, it is really about love. It is really about people coming together from divergent backgrounds and experiences. Even at the early onset of Christianity, it was about bringing the Jews and the Gentiles together. And so this idea that as a religion and as people of faith, that it is acceptable that Sunday mornings in many contexts is still the most segregated day of the week, it's absolutely insane. I was fortunate because even to this day, my father is 81 years old. He was so involved in the civil rights movement that the FBI tracked him down. And I'm not going to tell y'all, because some of y'all would judge my daddy if I told you what he was tracked down for. But what I would tell you is that it was radical. But he has always understood, even as someone who came into the ministry, the value and the role of faith and ensuring justice. And the Bible speaks of this. It speaks about right and justice, righteousness and justice, not being, separate entities. They're really quite symbiotic in nature. And I think that we think about the role of the church in that context. And that's really not just unfortunate, it's outright wrong. And I think what has disappointed me the most as a Black woman is to sort of really understand that history that you so perfectly articulated in your introduction of the role that the church played in the civil rights movement, to sort of evolve and in the 21st century see the Black church in many instances sort of have not been really holding that space or fulfilling that space in many contexts. I know my dad's church is, but it's not this one of these mega churches that everyone knows about. I think there are, pure religion type organizations that still exist that are doing the good work, but they're oftentimes not heard of. Because of internalized oppression, I think that a lot of our Black churches have become businesses, because many times we are able to self-actualize in the church in ways that we have not been able to actualize in the world because of structural racism. We have not been able to live lives that were similar to our white brothers and sisters. And so the Black church has really been the place where we can create these incredible businesses, quite honestly, that do a lot of good, but they're quite silent on justice issues. And so when Black unarmed men have been getting killed, the Black church in many instances has been silent, which again, to me is quite unfortunate. Now, that's not everyone. There are churches and some megachurch leaders that have always been doing the work, and they've always been speaking about this sort of connection between race and justice, and faith. But that is more of an exception than it has been the rule. And I think even now, Black churches are trying to figure out, as white churches are, how do they now hold this space? How do they continue to operate? Because this is the deal, y'all. The way it has been happening is not going to continue to go on. We're not going to let up. Abolitionists in this day will not let up. The world now understands and knows. We've seen enough videos. We've seen enough horrific, brutal murders now that there is no going back. So I applaud you and others that are trying to figure it out, because if you don't take the time in this season to really figure out how to move forward, you are going to not only be left behind, but you're going to find yourself in an increasing minority.
So you're hopeful that there's a way to right the ship, that there are steps, and if you could elaborate a little bit about what steps would you like to see churches and faith leaders take in order to sort of get back on track in the way that they were in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, well, the Bible even speaks about, study to show yourself approved to God and to man, right? So this idea that we're going to sort of through osmosis figure this out is just not going to happen. People are going to have to read. Churches are going to have to, in my opinion, turn their Bible study times into times where we are discussing books that we're all collectively reading to understand racism and to understand things like white fragility, which has done more to limit the evolution of relationships than I can personally attest to that than anything else I can think of. And white folks are going to have to take responsibility for those type of emotional meltdowns that do not create the type of healthy dialogues and exchanges in order to really move relationships forward. I think that until we understand the language, until we understand from a technical, almost academic standpoint, the history of this and how we've been complicit in it and the responsibility that we have to take to dismantle structural racism in this country, then again, you're just going to get more of the same. But again, I think that the pressure is just very different now. And so I think that people are going to be forced to learn how to be better. And I think the church is the perfect platform for that. And I just think that you have to operate with a great deal of intentionality. And I know that for some people, they may get angry at the idea of turning Bible study, into these race dialogues or these race sessions. I just think that it's necessary, because I don't think that we're going to be able to coexist anymore in a context that does not encapsulate justice.
Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much to unpack in what you said, and I appreciate your time this evening. We're going to come back to some of the things that you just talked about, but we're going to hear from our next guest, Mr. Jerry Daring. Jerry taught social justice at McGill-Tulane High School and Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. He's on the boards of the Mobile Christian Jewish Dialogue and the Gulf Coast Center for Holocaust and Human Rights Education. He's the author of 5 books on social justice themes, 4 books on the Holocaust, and 3 on spirituality. Thank you, Jerry, so much for joining us this evening. Do you mind sharing with us first about the work that you're doing with the Father Abram Joseph Ryan statue? And you're going to have to give us some background because many of our viewers are primarily from Acadiana.
Yeah. So in 1913, a group of civic leaders in Mobile unveiled, this was at the height of the Jim Crow era of segregation. This group of civic leaders in Mobile unveiled a statue to Father Abram Ryan. Father Ryan was a poet and an orator. He had spent 13 years in Mobile. After the Civil War, he wrote poetry that extolled the just cause, that the Confederates fought for. And so he became the great poet of the lost cause. And I am convinced that that's a major reason why the statue was put up in Mobile in his honor. The plaque that's at the base of the statue reads, "Father Ryan, poet priest of the Confederacy." When the protests started around the country a couple of months ago, the protest in Mobile began at the Father Ryan statue, and they marched to the statue of Raphael Semmes, who was a Confederate admiral. Now, subsequently, the city of Mobile has taken down the statue of Admiral Semmes. They paid the state government $25,000 fine to do that because there was a law against tampering with Confederate monuments. And I would like to see them take down the statue of Father Ryan. First of all, because like all Confederate monuments, it's offensive to African Americans. And by the way, it's in an area of Mobile that is predominantly African American, which makes it doubly offensive. But for me personally, I would like to see the statue come down because it's offensive to the best tradition of the Catholic Church. So, Elsa, let me tell you that for the last century and a half, the Catholic Church has been trying to articulate an approach to justice that is fundamental to our faith, based on Scripture and based on the best traditions of the Church. We call it Catholic social teaching. And it talks about things such as the life and dignity of the human person, preferential option for the poor, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, rights and responsibilities, care for God's creation. Catholic social teaching represents the best of the Catholic tradition. Father Ryan represents an ugly side of Catholicism, a side that does not listen to the biblical messengers of justice like Isaiah and Amos, a side that forgets or doesn't understand the gospel message of challenging the status quo, a side that justified slavery and then justified segregation, and now refuses to face up to white supremacy and ignores the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a side of Catholicism that I'm not proud of at all. And let me tell you a comment, by the way, based on something that you and Lanice talked about with regard to the two sides of Catholicism, the good side and the ugly side. You both painted a very nice picture of Catholic participation in the Selma March. Well, the reason why they had to go all over the country and bring priests and nuns from all over the country in Alabama to march in Alabama was because the Catholic Bishop of Mobile forbade any local priest or nun to participate in the march. So you had the good side and the bad side of Catholicism represented in the march. And that's what I'm saying. Father Ryan represents that bad side of Catholicism. Now, there is another statue in Mobile. It's a statue of a Catholic man who was mayor of Mobile during the civil rights years of the middle of the last century, Joseph Langan. And the statue shows Mayor Langan shaking hands with a Black leader named Joseph LaFleur. Those two men worked together during the civil rights movement to keep blacks and whites in Mobile talking with each other so that they wouldn't fight. That's the kind of Catholicism that inspires me.
Thank you. And thank you for your honesty. I don't know that everybody's willing to do that. And I appreciate that leadership. Where are you where is either your group or you individually in the process of getting that statue moved or removed?
Well, I wrote a booklet. What I did was I did research. I went to archives in several, not just in Mobile, but in other places in the country, and read everything that I could find on and put it all together. And I put that all together in a booklet. After the protests that took place a couple of months ago, I mailed a copy to the mayor of Mobile, and his office called me up and asked me for more copies so their staff could study it. So I'm hopeful that something will come of that. I'm giving them a little bit of time, and then I'm going to be in touch with them to see where it goes. There's this state law that's an obstacle, but the city was willing to pay the $25,000 to get rid of the Admiral Sims monument. And if we have to do a fundraiser to raise $25,000 to get it. See, here's the problem, though. The problem is that there's a large segment of the Catholic community that is not going to support it. And they're not going to support it, first of all, because they're sympathetic to what Father Ryan stood for, unfortunately, but they're also not going to, because this is what a nice thing for Catholics to be able to point to say, here's this statue of our Catholic priest, and here, so it's not going to come easy from outside of the Catholic community to rid of. So, but we're trying.
Yeah, I was thinking about that it must be doubly hard, right? So we have not related to a religious figure, but we do have a statue in the center of Lafayette that we're working on removing. But I imagine that having that extra layer of it being a religious leader makes it doubly difficult. But thank you for your work. And I was wondering, has your interpretation of Catholicism in your work and what drives you and your calling to social justice, which is, vast and multi-layered, has that evolved over time?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, I just had a request. Somebody asked me if I had ever done anything on racism, and I pulled out a outline for a session that I did 16 years ago, and looking at that and saying, yeah, it's pretty good, but I've learned a lot in 16 years. And so if you're not growing, like right now, 16 years ago, police brutality was not a major topic in discussing racism. It is today. So yeah, things go. The other thing too is that I think that the same thing with your faith life. If you're not constantly growing in your understanding of your faith, and I'm privileged, for example, to go as many times as I can to join with Rabbi Steve. He does study of scripture, and I go to the synagogue and listen, because you can't ever stop learning and growing. And so yes, I do feel as though I understand things a whole lot better. I understand myself and my faith better.
Do you see a time where the Catholic Church would do like what Lenise was talking about integrating historical education around race and what does anti-racism really look like with biblical study? Do you see that there would be a space for that?
Oh, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, there are some in some of the Catholic universities, a lot of good stuff is taking place in academia. And so it's I mean, and the it's the Catholic Church is a 2,000-year-old organization that's very, and it's an organization, so it's an institution. By nature, institutions move slowly. Catholic Church is, famous for moving slowly, things in very much long-term things. So yeah, it takes a while, but things are changing. Things are changing. A lot has changed under recent popes that have been very, for example, just the whole idea of referring to racism as a sin. See, one of the things Nice talked about white Christians. One of the things that is a block for right Christians is this whole concept of personal sin and personal relationship with Jesus. And what happens is we in that personal relationship with God, we lose a sense of the social component of morality. And so we tend, if put it in Catholic terms, if you can't confess it, then don't feel guilty about it, And so when was the last time that I did something nasty to a Black person? I never do anything nasty to a Black person, so I have nothing to feel guilty about. Whereas, in fact, I'm part of a system that makes it very difficult for African Americans to live in our society. You understand? And that's the problem that we have to face and deal with.
That is so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So Skyra jumped in and she said that I appreciate this history that you're presenting, Jerry. We can achieve so much more if we understand historical context. So I knew she would be listening tonight. Thank you. We're going to be bringing you back in a few, but I'd like now to welcome our third guest this evening, Rabbi Steven Silberman, or Rabbi Steve, as he's known to many throughout Mobile and beyond. He served and has served as the historic congregation Ahavas Chesed for 30 years. He's living in Mobile and becoming part of the Jewish community, and viewing himself and his family as Mobilians have been and continue to be meaningful and fulfilling. Primarily engaged in Jewishly educating and supporting the members of the synagogue, Rabbi Steve enjoys working with schools, churches, and civic groups to promote shared understanding among diverse communities. He is involved in the Mobile Christian-Jewish Dialogue, which is one of the oldest dialogues in the U.S., and he's a founding member of the steering committee of the Mobile Jewish Christian Muslim Trialogue. So thank you, Rabbi Steve, for joining us tonight. And
thank you for welcoming me. I'm grateful to be here.
So I wanted to start maybe a little bit where you can explain what the establishment and what the work of the Trialogue is.
A little bit of background. First, I'm grateful to some good local friends who have taught me much about improving the world, one of whom is Jerry Daring. I've learned much from Jerry, and Jerry and others have been involved with the Mobile Christian-Jewish Dialogue. We started in the late 70s, literally one of the first chapters of dialogue in the United States happened in Mobile, Alabama, of all places. And we shouldn't take for granted where we think we are and how we hopefully have improved in terms of establishing dialogue and better understanding of people between Jewish and Christian traditions and backgrounds. So about 15 or so years ago, people began to talk, and some of us were noticing that our nation is in a dire need of expanding its understanding of who we are as a community. And it's no longer fit to talk only about Jews and Christians. We need to widen our understanding. And so I felt compelled to do some work to help bring a better extended reach to Muslim Americans here in our own local community. And unfortunately, when COVID broke out, we had to temporarily table our work. But for the past 8, 9, 10 years, we've had ongoing communication with people of different backgrounds here in Mobile. And as I said, I'm grateful to Jerry and others who helped lay the groundwork for me to realize that it's time for me to contribute to making our world a better place. So I want to back up. You gave a beautiful introduction, and you asked, what are our drivers? And I want to share 3 elements within Jewish life as to what makes me move. And the first is, we've got a banner here. When we think about the book of Genesis, which I consider a spiritual motivator par excellence, we talk about the world being created. How often do people ask, why did God create the world with only one man and one woman? It would have been much easier just to create a populated world. And the traditional Jewish understanding is that because the world needed to have people come into it to build life. Following on the heels of Adam and Eve, people are familiar with Cain and Abel. And there's a very important Jewish commentary on the terrifying experience of a brother killing a brother that goes as follows. The blood of one person is equated with the blood of the entire world. When you destroy one person, you destroy an entire world. When you heal one person, when you prevent the bleeding of one person, you heal a world, you save an entire world. So on a spiritual level, the message for me of early Genesis is that we come into the world and we have to realize that we have the capacity to give life to the world or terrifyingly destroy the world. And that's one of the main drivers that I have in my life. And I labeled that here on the banner, spiritual Genesis, creation of the world. The second driver that I would say within my heart and in my spirit is that of Isaiah. Isaiah is famously described in Hebrew scripture as calling for light to be brought into the world. What does it mean for a world to need light? It means there's an awareness that the world is dark. We're not speaking of what you and I might call visible darkness or lack of light. We're talking about a darkness and a need for light that is much more profound. And that's what Isaiah is shouting to my ancestors 2,700 years ago. And it's become an incredibly important part of our Jewish tradition to bring light into the world. And so that's my second motivator, or my second driver, if you will. And the third element that we might see as, I'm just typing into the chat right now so we can put it up on the banner. That's a very important element within Jewish tradition, is what's called tikkun olam. And sometimes it's spelled in English, Tikkun, next word Olam, tikkun olam. Tikkun olam literally means to repair the world. And it is a mystical element. So why would there be a mystical genre of commentary that puts forth the message that we need to repair the world? Because there's an awareness that sometimes the world is broken. For me to learn from my ancestors that there's an awareness that there are features in the world that are broken, and each one of us has to lift up his or her own energies to repair the brokenness, is spellbinding. And I want to go back to something that you introduced at the earlier part of the segment, when you spoke of people of different backgrounds, Jewish and Catholic and Protestant and all backgrounds, walking to Selma and beginning a journey which is still in need of going forth. And there have been Jewish people at many different points along the way who have participated. Some of them were very religious, and some of them were not religious. They would even call themselves secular. And you might ask, how does that emerge from a Jewish sensibility? And I'll say this. Within Jewish life, there are those who are very religiously inspired, and they might look at scripture such as Genesis or Isaiah and say, that is the reason that I need to come into the world. Because of Genesis, the creation of the world, because of, God forbid it shouldn't happen, fratricide, brother killing brother, Cain and Abel, and recognizing that one life is equated with the entire world, or with Isaiah's message of coming forth and bringing light into a dark place. But there might also be people who are not very religiously minded, but they're, let's say, spiritually minded, or even mystically minded. And they will often turn to the idea within Jewish tradition from the mystical series of commentaries of the world is broken, and it's up to me to help repair it. So if and when you ask Jewish people, what motivates you to make the world better, you will hear people say, I'm religious, I feel and I hear God's message in my ears and within my being, and I have to respond. And those who are not necessarily focused on hearing the message from God, but they know the world is broken, and it's up to each and every one of them.
That's so much to digest. When I heard you talking about the first driver, that spiritual, one life, one world idea, something that we talk about in movement work is living fractally, that the idea of what you do and how you show up in the world is fractal, right? And so it affects everything around you, and people mimic each other. That's how the world works, So if you show up in a way that you're staying in right relationship with others, you're respecting others, it will infect either, in a positive way in that case, or in a negative way if you're not doing that, fractally the people around you. And so it's beautiful. And I appreciate your sharing that. And, something that I think that you could uniquely speak to is, what role do you see pastoral care playing in social justice, for congregants who may have been harmed? What is your personal experience, and how do you see pastoral care playing a role in that social justice work?
That's a very powerful question. Unfortunately, the coronavirus crisis has driven many of our people indoors. And many of our people, and I speak only of my synagogue and of my colleagues in their synagogues, but I imagine in churches as well, and community institutions, people are driven indoors because of the fear of not wanting to catch and fear of not wanting to transmit the virus. So there are, I think, many people who would likely be involved in grassroots, on-the-ground social justice efforts and initiatives who right now feel that they can't. And that's a tremendously frustrating element. So speaking just personally here in Mobile, I've been invited with some local pastors to develop a bit more of a close and ongoing relationship with and awareness of local policing initiatives. And we're trying to develop constructive and interactive dialogue with members of the law enforcement community. When people have a fear of catching or transmitting a virus, then they're not able to show up to a meeting. They're not able to show up and gather with local law enforcement or local community leaders and civic leaders. So it's frustrating. And I'll give you a related example. We're having some of our meetings on Zoom. Well, that pulls away from what we want to be a natural momentum where we come together as people and we try to build coalitions and networks so we can go forward in a variety of daily mechanisms of trying to make the world better. So it's very frustrating, and I'm hopeful that in the very near future, there'll be a diminishing of the fear of COVID, so we can really marshal all of our efforts to improve our local communities' lives. I personally am very frustrated that I am not able to be as interacting with my own local synagogue community. We happen to have a community that is, I can't say largely, but significantly comprised of people of senior citizen ages. And obviously people who are of a senior citizen age background are vulnerable. And so we are being very careful. And it's very frustrating.
I want to go back a little bit. So you were listing the drivers, spiritual, moral, mystical. For you, do you find that first one is your primary driver? Or is it a combination of the three?
It's a combination of three, but I do want to say that I have learned from my ancestors and my forebears. And Abraham Joshua Heschel, who left this world too soon, taught at my seminary when I was being ordained in New York City, Jewish Theological Seminary, and his voice is still echoing through the halls, although he left the seminary in the early 70s, and I was ordained in 1990. But when I learned from my friend Jerry Daring and other local neighbors and friends about the importance of going out into the streets or meeting people in their homes or working in neighbor institutions and community centers, I realized how important it is to do social justice work. Some Jewish people are very inclined to work with agencies and organizations and institutions to make a tremendous difference. And I applaud people who have that capacity and that power within them. There can be another way of bringing social justice initiatives into the world, and that's working one-on-one with a neighbor or a friend. And some Jewish people find redemptive power by getting acquainted with somebody whom they don't know, perhaps an African American, perhaps somebody who is Christian, perhaps somebody who comes from a different neighborhood, perhaps somebody from a different socioeconomic background. How can you and I open our eyes to the beauty of what the human race is without first saying hello to somebody who's a little bit different than me or you? So what I think I can offer people in my synagogue is not only working with agencies and community organizing, but also reminding them that each person can reach out to a neighbor and be reached out to by a neighbor. And that will also make a significant impact here in America today. We live in Mobile, which is a small southern community. Contributing to Mobile's improvement is going to contribute to the improvement of the South and hopefully the United States as well.
Yeah. Yeah. We like to say that, we engage in dialogue because we don't know everything. And it's only by extending, an open heart and open line of communication that you can learn from others, really. So thank you so much. I'd like to welcome everybody back now. Maybe each of you can take a minute or two to say anything that you feel has been left unsaid or you feel like you want to say in order to feel finished. And also, please take this as an opportunity to let us know about things that we need to look out for or important information to share. And Skyra's got a question. Jerry, why do you think it is important for those in the Catholic faith to incorporate racial and social justice into Catholic education? If you want to do that first, and then we'll do a round robin.
Because that's the only way to be true to our scripture. Our religion is based on scripture, Rabbi Steve's scripture plus our New Testament, and the only way to be faithful to that is to pursue racial justice. Not to do that is to be unfaithful to the very foundation of our tradition.
Thank you. Lanice, you wanna start by anything you want to say or let us know about?
Yeah, I just want to say, sort of in response to what Rabbi Stephen just said about this idea of people being inside and really not being able to advance organizing work. Just like we all got online tonight to have this really important conversation, I think that we're going to have to consider people actually engaging online as a form of activism. Many of my white allies and friends, one of them I see right now that's logged on, Gary Moore, I just love how he uses that platform to speak truth around race and the history of race. I have other white ally friends who do the same. I think it's very necessary, and I think that when people don't use that as an opportunity, a lot of times it's because of fear. It's the same fear that sort of have people stymied, so to speak, even in interacting people, face to face. So I think that if you listen to a couple of things, one, if you're listening to what the prophets are saying in the prophetic world, they're suggesting that COVID is only the first of probably other viruses that we're going to have to contend with that they already don't have a vaccine for. We may be inside for a long time, folks, and I think that if you're really listening in the spirit realm, I think that, really God is calling us to revolutionize the church in terms of the way that we interact and the way that we connect. What I've loved the most about this is that I get to see how some of my other white friends worship. I forget what it's called, but one of my friends, Judith Comer, she and her husband, they do this thing every night. It's like a prayer that they do. I forget what they call it, but I had no idea, and so I'm sort of learning through these online platforms how other people are worshiping, which has been incredible and also brings inspiration into my own life. So I just kind of wanted to add that because I don't want us to, and I'm not suggesting that you were doing that, I just don't want us to give people excuses for not engaging, because I think that we're going to probably be in this space for quite some time, and we're going to have to think differently about how we actually move forward. Also, in terms of what Jared just said, just want to say that, one of the things that the white church did is that they basically gave theological license, so to speak, to racism in terms of how, ultimately as a religious, sort of body conceded to the idea of racism. So this idea of going back to what the word actually says and educating ourselves so that we can do it the right way, to me is the way we've got to now center our faith. I think it's just necessary. I don't think that God will be pleased if we don't do that. I think that he's calling us to operate in the context of truth and to become truth tellers. And the last thing I'll say is that church by design should make us uncomfortable, right? So, if you got a preacher or a pastor that's not calling you out on your sin, especially in the context of racism in this season, then you might need to find you a preacher that's going to tell you the truth, because conceding, Rabbi talked about how this part of the Catholic Church basically sort of shares this kind of idea. Anybody who is finding solidarity with racists, even if they are wearing the cloth, should be ashamed. And we should not make people comfortable in that type of thinking. And so I think that pastors and leaders, they've got a lot of work to do. I think as parishioners and followers, we've got a lot of work to do. But it starts with leadership. And the fact of the matter is that there's just been a dearth of leadership in the context of leading people in truth in this way. So that's all I have to say. And I just really feel like I got me two more white brothers from another mother, and I'm really looking forward to us engaging beyond this. It's really been incredible.
Thank you, Lanice. Jerry, you want to?
Well, I wanted to say something about anti-Semitism, and the reason why I want to bring it up is because, we're talking about African American. That's the big issue right now with Black Lives Matter and so forth. But all these stereotyping and discriminations are of a piece. They're related, and we need to aggressively go after all of them. And if we do, if we improve, if whites improve relations with blacks, then that's going to help Christian whites to improve relations with Jews, because all of these things are of a piece. We are all children of Adam and Eve, right, Rabbi? We are one family, and anything that helps us to come to understand that viscerally in our gut, to where it informs the way that we live, anything that helps us in that way. And so there's no such thing, for example, as getting rid of white racism as targeted towards blacks, but holding on to your anti-Semitism. That ain't going to happen. I just wanted to add that point.
Thank you so much. Rabbi, you want to bring it on home?
I want to take a little bit of the best from Jerry and from Lanice. Number one, from Jerry, I continue to learn every single day. Education is critical, and rabbis and Jewish teachers have to share messages of openness and of love. And as Lanice said, we have to get our communities up and moving. And you're right, even if we are currently inside because of COVID, we can still change the world, and we have to. I want to talk about one more element of a spiritual perspective of instruction, and that is family. And it can be a nuclear family, it can be an extended family, it can be a blended family. Families of very different ages, older and younger, moms, grandparents, and so on, are critical influencers on every single one of us. We need to tap into the potential of all of our spiritual communities at the core, which is the family, the home, however we define it, because our next generation, our current generation, and even our past generations, all influenced by the dynamics of the family. When we can harness the family to being caring and open-minded and constructive and productive and eliminating racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia, then our world will be beautiful. So, and thank you for this opportunity, Elsa. Thanks for bringing us all in. We're grateful to all of you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much to you guys. We've definitely spoken a lot of truth tonight. And as Lanice said, it starts with leadership, and each of you all are leaders. And so thank you for setting a path for us to follow. I also want to leverage her relationships in order for us to be able to have you guys here tonight. So in closing, a reminder that on Friday at 6 p.m., Skyra will be in conversation with Pastor Ronaldo Hardy of All Nations Worship Assembly in Baton Rouge and Pastor Tracy Millard as they discuss the relationship between Christianity and race. I do hope you will join us. And lastly, if you are a dialogue leader, a teacher, a leader in your business, a faith leader, a youth leader, and you would like to develop your facilitation skills around diversity, equity, and inclusion, don't forget to register for our facilitation training. We're working to assemble a strong, well-balanced cohort. So there is an application process, and the short form did need to be completed by last Monday. But shoot us a Facebook message if you need until tomorrow afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.